Linux Luddites, episode 79, for the 30th of May, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. Welcome back, Jesse. Thank you very much. I just wanted to congratulate you both on your new segment last week. I really enjoyed listening to it. And likewise, this week we'll have the news, of course. Afterwards, Paddy explains his complicated way of encrypting data on the cloud and how there's actually some new software that means that people like I can now do that. And we have your feedback. And then Paddy and I try and persuade Joe one way or the other on net neutrality. So we'll see how that goes. And I just wanted to bring to people's attention the guys over at Linux Voice. In fact, it's the community behind Linux Voice have made Arcavium, which is a website that's got all of their sort of back catalogues, and also you can search by type of article, or sort of you can search by keywords and things. So it's a really good source if you want to go and see some of the things they've been writing about, or maybe find some information on them. So that's just a shout out to them. But with that, I guess we'll crack on with the news.
And let's start the news with Google I/O, which you can't have not heard about. Every website's been talking about it. Every podcast's been talking about it. So let's not do this in too much depth. I suppose, what were your guys' impressions of it? What did you take away from this year's Google I/O?
Well, I think firstly, Google had to come out with some sort of voice-recognized home type device, mirroring Amazon's Echo, and so it's no surprise that came out. And the other one that would sort of confuse me a little bit was the two new messaging apps, Allo and Duo. The first one is sort of an update to normal text messaging, but they've already got a messaging app, and they've got Hangouts, and Duo is a video-only messaging app, but as I said, they've already got Hangouts, which does videos as well. So it really feels like they've come out with a whole load of applications when they should just make one or maybe two really good sort of applications that do all of that. I was a bit surprised, and that's a bit of an odd direction to go.
Yeah, I've got to say the two things that struck me as themes throughout the whole event were exactly what you touched on, and that's the AI side of things, which seems to be being wrapped into everything, plus the traditional scattergun approach, which you could say they're trying new things, so they try it in a new way in a single application, and that seems fair enough. But you've got to be aware that half of these things are going to die a death within 2 or 3 years, so you never want to be getting invested in any of them.
Yeah, it's difficult for a normal user to work out which one they should invest in. I mean, on my phone now I have 4 different messaging apps, 2 of which are Google and 2 of which are non. And if they start saying, this is the way you need to do video, do you know if the person that you want to communicate with has Duo, or are they using, Skype, or are they using the standard Hangouts, or whatever it might be? It just becomes a bit of a muddied water, doesn't it?
It does. And I mean, the thing that really struck me about the video application, or the thing that made me sit up and think, that's quite clever, was it being displayed on your lock screen. But I can see all sorts of mischief being available for people with that. You sat in a meeting and suddenly your phone goes off and the screen lights up and something rather dubious is appearing on your lock screen.
You know what really struck me about the whole thing was every little, at least consumer-facing announcement they made, everything had this trade-off between privacy and functionality. It was a case of, here's a load more functionality, but we're going to sacrifice your privacy for that. Like with the messaging app being able to predict what you are going to say next, well, the only way they can do that is by logging everything that you've ever said, and then using machine learning and AI and stuff to predict what you're going to say next. And just every little announcement, it just seemed to be the kind of this halo around it of, you're going to sacrifice your privacy, but it's going to be really cool because you're going to have all these features. And for me, once you notice that, you realize that I don't really want any of these new things that they're putting out there.
But that's not looking at specifically what you've been saying and therefore what you might have to return back. It's sort of doing a group collective, and it says, if it says cinema in the original message, it might say, I enjoy the cinema or not tonight. So it's not like knowing what you think of a cinema, it's knowing what people generally think. Did you see the one with the dog, like nice hound or something? You think, well, that's quite a specific thing to be saying. So I don't think it's churning through your messages and things. It's more like you said with the machine learning, it knows that that's the general theme that's going on and punctuates what you might want to respond quickly.
Oh, that's not my understanding. I thought that, they're going to do what you said there, but they're also going to learn from what you type normally, the kind of syntax you use and words you spell incorrectly deliberately, and your turn of phrase, basically. That was my understanding of it, that it is definitely going to invade your privacy to, make it better for you.
I've got to say that was my understanding as well. I mean, even simple things like when you're trying to book a restaurant or something, it obviously knows where you are, so it can suggest local venues and knows where the other people you're inviting are. So I think very much it is a personalised, tailored service.
Fair enough. I'll stand down on that one. The only other thing that I noticed was they obviously talking about Android Wear, and the apps will now be standalone, so you won't actually need a phone to use, I guess, some of the apps, if not maybe not all of them. And instant apps, which we've covered on the news before, so that's allowing you to use an application on your phone but without having it installed. So it actually is basically serving it up to you in the way that the app would look, which is clever if you have apps that you don't often use. And I'll often find that I'll reformat my phone and go through the list of applications I've installed and think, I only actually ever use, 20% of these regularly, but I've just once or twice used these other ones. So if there are maybe lightweight phones that don't have a lot of space on them, and you only want to use an app once or twice, that means you don't have to fully install it and you can save that extra space.
I think this is incredibly important, actually, and I haven't seen much press about it or the potential impact of this, because they demoed this within the chat application, didn't they, within Allo? And really, I think what's going on here is them trying to keep you within their ecosystem. So it's their bots you're dealing with. You're not dealing with anyone else's bots, and they can go and fetch applications for you or bits of applications. And it's all to keep your data entry and any interaction you have with Google as much as possible, rather than going off to other services. So from a data harvesting point of view, it's really important to them.
I definitely agree with that, but we talked about this before, didn't we? The idea of kind of apps on the fly. And I think I said this, what I'm about to say at the time, and that is, what are we actually talking about here? We're talking about on your phone, it's going to go off to some server and download a bit of code, and then it's going to run that code on your device, and that it's going to be part of an app. Isn't that just what the web is? I don't understand how this is any different from just accessing a website. It sends you some stuff, you deal with that stuff, be it, PHP and JavaScript and HTML and CSS. It's slightly different, I suppose, in that it might send slightly different code down to you, but the principle is the same, surely.
Perhaps they should call it Scopes and it'll become incredibly popular.
You never know.
Anyway, bad jokes aside, a couple of other things I wanted to mention about sharing of apps. This is something I believe happens on Apple platforms already. Not having ever touched one, I don't know about it. But apparently, if the developer agrees, you'll now be able to share apps that you purchase on Google Play with up to 6 family members.
How do they prove who's a family member?
It's a very good question.
That you haven't got an answer for. Yeah, it sounds like you could probably just elect a few friends to be your supposed family members. Unless they've all got to have the same name or something, but then not all families do have the same name. So that it seems like it could easily be abused. But it's funny you mentioned the Apple thing. You linked in the show doc here to an article by, it's on Apple Insider, so it's by a huge Apple fanboy, just going through how Google are just trying to play catch up with Apple and failing on everything. And it's an incredibly negative article. And it was a very good and amusing read. You have to take it with a pinch of salt because it is such an Apple fanboy. But it is interesting that a lot of this Google I/O stuff, you could be read that way, that they're trying to catch up with Apple and just they're not doing a brilliant job of it.
Yeah, I think the point of the article was that normally at each of the major conferences of Google and Apple over the year, one will step forward and say, we've got this, and this coming out, and look at us moving forward. And then the other one will catch up and overstep, and they're forever sort of jumping over each other. But at this one, it didn't feel as much like there was any sort of massive breakthrough. I mean, yes, they've got some new applications. Yes, they've caught up with Amazon, with the Home Hub, and they talked about things like VR and this, but it's all existing technology. They haven't sort of come out with a massive shell shock of an announcement, which I think was the point of the Apple story, which was comically one-sided.
Yeah, you're right. It was a very negative piece, as you'd probably expect from the source. But it was also very interesting, and it's good to see things from someone else's point of view, I thought, which was one of the reasons I put it in there. Something I took away from it, I think is very true, is that Apple seems to be making a lot more progress in the corporate space than Android does. And the announcements regarding corporates and how you bring your own devices and what have you in that space from this keynote, I don't know, I didn't see anything at all, really.
Well, as the representative from a massive corporation, I guess I'll put my tuppence in. Absolutely. We only give out iPhones. So if you ever see anyone with two phones and one's an Android, that's their personal phone and the other one's an iPhone. I've seen some people from other companies that have BlackBerries still, which always surprises me. But even other companies, I often see iPhones. I don't think I've ever heard of one that gives out Android phones and iPads and things like this. So you're absolutely right. Apple are smashing the enterprise market. And I don't know how or what Google is doing to try and get into it. I think I don't want to say it's lost in the same way that Microsoft is already, a massive dominant force there, but I don't see how they're going to get back into it and push Apple off.
Presumably iPhones have got all Exchange support and everything, and that's what Google needs to get better at then, maybe.
Yeah, everyone replies their emails and stuff on their phone, so it's all works with Exchange because, we're Microsoft on the PC and Apple in the hand, if you will. And so they clearly work together. I am saying this from a point of view of not being high enough up the ranks to have one.
You don't qualify for one, you have to use your own phone.
Yeah, exactly. I had to give my own phone number out and blank the calls at the weekend.
Well, just dragging it back to announcements for a minute, I said there were two things that caught my eye before you took me off in a different direction, Joe. And the other one was to do with Android itself, and that was the introduction of Chrome-style seamless updates.
Oh, yeah, I'd heard about that one. So you're going to have a separate partition, or basically two partitions, aren't you? Two system partitions, so that one can be updated in the background. And you don't have to reboot and wait for that optimizing apps business for several minutes or, up to half an hour, some people complain about, which sounds good in theory, but I'm concerned that storage is quite, it's at a premium on these devices. So does it mean that you're going to have even less user available storage? They'll advertise a 16 or 32 gig phone. Does that mean you'll have even less available to you?
Android and Google get a lot of bad reputation for the fragmentation there is and how many of the phones out there are up to the latest version. Whereas compare that to Chromebooks, and they are updated without you seeing it, and they just go in the background every time you reboot. They've been updated. And that's one of the things that makes them ideal for schools and things. And the latest information out is that Chromebooks have outsold Macs for the first time in the US. So there's an estimated 1.76 million Macs sold in the first quarter of 2016. So the estimation is that Chromebooks sold about 2 million. And I think this is probably, while they're quite cheap and people find them easy to get online and things, so they're obviously selling well in the domestic market, it's probably also to do with the number that are in schools. And we've certainly touched on it in previous news articles about how many are being sold in schools. And, if you've got one school that says we're going to switch over to Chromebooks, that's thousands and thousands of devices. So that really is going to make up a large proportion of the sales, I think.
But it's all in the education sector, isn't it? It's not really consumers who are buying these things. It's schools, which I suppose they don't really care about. In a way, they're probably happier about it being in schools because it means that the kids are getting into the Google ecosystem earlier, and then they're going to be customers for life. Well, they're not really customers, are they? Because there's no product. The product is you. They're going to be products for life.
Yeah, and of course, one of the reasons I think that Chromebooks haven't taken off in the domestic market, if you like, in the consumer market, is they've been seen as very limited devices. I mean, there's only a small amount of applications sat up in the Chrome store, and you can only do things when you're online. Well, that's people's perceptions of Chromebooks. It's not necessarily true, but that's going to change fairly rapidly because the Play Store, the Android Play Store, is coming to Chrome OS. Actually putting the entire Android framework into a container, apparently, all the way down to the hardware abstraction layer, and you can install every single app from the Android Play Store onto a Chromebook. Now, not everything will work exactly because Chromebooks, I understand, don't have things like GPS positioning and what have you. But it's going to give you a huge variety of applications there out of the box that will run quite happily offline.
So let me start by being positive about this. Excellent, more stuff to play with on a Chromebook, except not for me, because even though my C720 is relatively beefy in terms of its processor and it's got 2 gigs of RAM, so it's well capable of this, it's not supported. It's only Chromebooks from the last couple of years that are going to be supported with this. So the C720 will still get updates and security patches, but it's not going to get this new feature. So that's a bit of a bummer to start with. I'm really, really hoping that someone will hack it so that I can make this work and I can test it out, but we'll have to see about that one. But the other negative is, why would you want to run Android apps on a laptop? We've been talking about this stuff for a long, long time, haven't we? With running Android x86 on a laptop, that was not really very, it was not very useful, was it? Just because the whole Android app design is for a touchscreen, a small-ish touchscreen. And even on tablets, sometimes the apps don't take full advantage of the bigger screen. So tiny little windows that require you to touch the screen on a laptop, I don't know, it just doesn't seem, as we are now with these apps, that that's going to necessarily be very useful. So it depends if developers then can develop kind of a laptop version of their Android app.
Yeah, which I think they'll have the incentive to do now that Google has made this announcement, and based on the number of Chromebooks out there, I think you're going to see apps that adapt to the form factor quite nicely now and don't necessarily require touch.
So that's kind of good news for things like Remix OS then?
You'd think so, yes. And with regards to the 2 years cutoff that you mentioned, I mean, that does seem entirely arbitrary because, as you say, some older Chromebooks, things like the original Pixel even, are very well spec'd in comparison to some of the low-end hardware available today. So that does appear to be totally arbitrary.
I wonder if they'll reverse that decision. I wonder if they will get it working on the newer ones and then sort of backport it to the older machines. I think it would be a mistake for them not to do that, because surely a lot of the Chromebooks that are out there and still running, I mean, my C720 is in pretty terrible cosmetic condition, and now I've stuck stickers all over it and everything. But in terms of the hardware, touch wood, it's running pretty well. And I'm sure there are loads of them. And the original Pixel as well. I mean, that was a beefy machine. So I really hope that they do reverse this and end up supporting more of the older ones.
That wouldn't be in the interest of the hardware manufacturers, though. And you've got to think that Google are going to help out the hardware manufacturers here by saying we're not going to backport it, and therefore people will rush out and buy new machines.
But is Google therefore saying that the future of laptops is like phones, where you're expected to replace it every 2 years? Because most people with a laptop get 5, 6 or more years out of it. I mean, some people have 10-year-old laptops that are still running. And yeah, I mean, how old is yours? If you look at Windows, I mean, Windows Vista is still supported technically, maybe not with features, but certainly with security updates. And a laptop that runs Vista will run Windows 10 generally, so it can get all of the new features. So if Google is really going to compete with Microsoft in the laptop space, they need to have longer hardware support, as far as I'm concerned, because, I mean, especially in the enterprise and stuff, there's no way people are going to buy a Chromebook and then expect to replace it 2 years later.
I mean, this is a one-off, isn't it, for the new feature set here we're talking about. But you've also got to think that Chromebooks are incredibly cheap in comparison to laptops, so people are more likely to see it as a disposable purchase and therefore contemplate renewing it every 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I wonder if we're seeing like you say, Joe, the same way that people are supposed to view phones being stamped upon laptops. And it's the same difference between how Apple releases things for iOS and OS 10 or whatever the main hardware is for, wherever the main software is for their hardware, versus standard Microsoft products where you upgrade the software but you can keep the hardware the same, but where Apple seems to update the software, push it out and force it upon you, and they will automatically depreciate older hardware, so you're sort of forced to upgrade. And this seems like very much the same sort of method where they stop supporting older hardware, so you're sort of left in limbo land, and therefore you have to upgrade, and it moves it over to the same way that they have on the phones. But the problem with the phones, as we mentioned earlier, is that the fragmentation, no one is running the latest, or very few people are running the latest software from the latest Android version. And so perhaps they're trying to do this in a way which stops that fragmentation from happening, because unlike Apple, who have one person who makes, or one company who makes their hardware themselves, Google has always had multiple hardware manufacturers for their phones, and it's not really within their grasp, their hands, to update it. But when it comes to Chrome OS on the Chromebooks, they do have the power to update it and keep it up to date and keep all the security updates and new features rolling out. So I think they're perhaps seeing the problem they had on the phones and trying to avoid it by forcing these updates and, unfortunately, dropping support in an Apple-type way.
Yeah, and one of the ways they're going to be keeping up to date and not allowing people to diverge here is by keeping some of it proprietary, at least in the short term. I mean, the question that sprung to my mind was whether this sort of containerized Android app framework could be ported over to Linux. And Selijrag Hornung, crazy name, crazy guy, who's the engineering director of Chrome and Android, has said that whilst they're leveraging a lot of open source work at the moment, they're currently not open sourcing the actual containerization code that they've written. And Hornung has said, quote, "I think this is an open question what we're going to be doing with it when we launch it, but at this point we don't have any plans to open source it immediately."
So that implies that it's not using existing open source technologies to do it then?
Or they're using software that has licenses which allow you to change it back to proprietary. So maybe we should all be using the GNU license.
Yeah, GPL for the win, eh, Paddy?
I'll take that. I'll take that silence as a yes.
Well, here's hoping that they open source it, because it would be good to get Android apps running on Linux. You can kind of do it now, but it sounds like this is going to be the best way to do it with containerization. It just seems to be the way you can do everything, like we talked about with Maru, and Docker is so popular, and with snaps on Ubuntu. So here's hoping anyway that we'll actually see some source code for it, but I'm not too confident on that one. But let's stay with more Android stuff. It seems to be quite Google and Android heavy, this new segment, which is not a huge surprise given I/O has just happened. And this time, Samsung is not going to use Android Wear for their watches anymore, and it's going to use Tizen from now on. And you have to wonder why, really, because there's a new version of Android Wear which seems to be improved, and Tizen, it's a bit of a sleeper hit for Samsung, isn't it? They haven't actually used Android Wear for quite a while now on their watches, and they're saying that they aren't going to be anymore. So maybe Tizen has finally found its place, and it's not on Indian smartphones, it's on Korean watches.
Yeah, Samsung have only actually released one Android Wear watch, and their other, I could only guess, half dozen or 2 dozen, because that's kind of the way Samsung does things, are all Tizen based. And it is the only sort of the third watch. Oh, sorry, I forgot about Pebble. The fourth kind of watch interface there is, Apple and Google, Pebble and Tizen. And I wonder whether it's a little bit of a sort of 2 fingers up to Google from Samsung, because, they get a lot out of Android, but they do everything they can to make it as Samsungized as possible. But, to then fall into bed with them on the watch as well, they just said, not us, thank you very much, we're going to do our own thing. But I've not actually seen any reviews of Tizen watches to understand whether or not the interface is any better, sort of reviews Google versus Tizen or Android versus Tizen. So I'd be interested to see if it is quicker and sharper and faster, but you then lose the functionality between having it linked to your phone and the various, fitness applications and sort of software that ties in with the Android ecosystem.
Is that true, though? I mean, I've never seen any of these devices, but I can remember when we looked at the Tizen phone from India, the actual Android support on that was actually really good.
Yeah, but I think that the Android apps would be expecting to see Android Wear, and when that Android app doesn't see Android Wear, unless they've very cleverly written Tizen to have all the same hooks and things, it would be surprising to me if it would work as seamlessly. I suspect that Samsung will launch a phone with almost identical apps as you would expect on Android, but solely to work nicely with their Tizen smartwatch.
Yeah, we're really in danger of speculation territory here. But I would have thought that a Tizen watch would work incredibly well with a Samsung phone, but maybe not necessarily with other Android phones. And I would doubt that it would work very well with iOS either, but all speculation, really.
Okay, let's take away from the speculation and move on. So, a bunch of executives from Firefox left to make H5OS, and they were going to receive some funding, and they were trying to make this version of Firefox effectively to run on low-end hardware. And the company was called Acadine. And unfortunately, they haven't received the funding that they believed was contractually committed to them, and so they've had to stop working, and all the engineers have had to down tools, and it's basically been on absolute pause, if not stopped. So it sounds like maybe the only tiny light or shard of light for Firefox to remain and carry on working as a phone OS may well have come to an end.
And does anyone really care about that? I don't suppose many people will, really. Firefox OS, at least for the phone, was never very good, was it? And so it's not a surprise that they haven't managed to improve it, really. And with such dominant platforms already, it just seems a bit pointless to even try and compete.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's sort of been knocking around my head about how any of these new phone operating systems would take on the might of the big two. So maybe we should have a chat about that over a pint in a future show.
Sounds like a really good idea, actually. Moving on then from the news and sticking with Google, sadly. It's been noted that empty source code trees appeared in the AOSP project code device tree that's been tagged Pi Foundation /RPi3, which has led to much, and I guess reasonable speculation that support for the Raspberry Pi 3 will soon appear in Android.
More speculation. Isn't this a bit of a non-story? Until some code actually appears there, it's a bit of a non-story. Just because they might be thinking about possibly supporting the Raspberry Pi 3 at some point in the future, I don't think we should get too excited yet about that. I mean, we're definitely not going to cover this on the Pi podcast if I have anything to do with it, because it's just pure speculation as far as I can see. I mean, maybe it's a bit more than that. Maybe it's more likely than it was before. And it would be great if they could actually do that, because they seem to be missing a trick. There's all these millions of Pis out there that are ARM boards that are well capable of running Android. And there's even an official touchscreen available for the Pi. So it just seems like a no-brainer. And I don't understand why it's taken them this long to do it. So I'm hoping they're going to dump a whole bunch of source code in there very, very soon. And we're going to see AOSP, and then people will take that and make it, hopefully, improved ROMs, and hopefully it won't be too hard to get the Play Store working in there. And suddenly a lot of Raspberry Pis that are sat in drawers will suddenly be put to use again, I think.
Yeah, and don't you think if they did do this, it would horribly undercut Jide's market? I mean, you're talking about Remix earlier in the news, and I've got to assume they make a fair proportion of their income from selling small devices like the Remix Mini that we bought to have a look at. And if it's available on the Pi, bog standard Android, that is going to slaughter their market share, isn't it?
Well, it depends how much of this windowing functionality and desktop stuff comes into Android. We've seen glimpses of it with the Android N previews, but we're up to a decent beta now that I've been running on the Nexus 9 that is actually usable, and there's no sign of that windowed stuff happening. So I could easily foresee it being in, an O in Android Oreo that we actually get this. So it's going to be a while still, I think, before we get fully windowed desktop environment, I suppose you would call it, on Android. which kind of ties in with the Chromebook stuff, doesn't it? Maybe they are planning to put support in to Chrome OS for Android apps so that developers will then make them more desktop friendly. So then Android itself can become more desktop friendly, and the apps will be actually ready for that when that happens in a year or so when O comes out. So I think that Jide are okay for now, but I think long term, yeah, you're right, Paddy, it could be a threat to their business model.
I'm sure the listeners are wondering, Joe, have you put your bet in as to what the O will stand for? Because it sounds like you're pretty on Oreo.
Well, I don't know. It all depends on whether N is some sort of what would it be?
Nutella?
Nutella, yeah. Whether they go down that route, because they did get a bit of criticism for Kit Kat, especially Nestle being one of the least ethical companies in the world. So we'll have to see. If they go for Nougat or something generic like that, then they probably won't go for Oreo.
I like to see that you've given this some real thought. I thought it was just off the cuff.
No, I genuinely have spent way too long thinking about this. It's serious business, man.
Put your bets on now.
Well, anyway, let's have a bit more Android stuff, and that is that Google is supposedly stepping up pressure on the OEMs to actually distribute the updates that Google has put out. And it's going to be making a list, or has made a naughty list of manufacturers that are rubbish at putting out the updates, like HTC and stuff. And there's it looks like they're threatening to publish that list, basically, to name and shame the OEMs that aren't giving the updates. But I mean, we've talked about this loads, haven't we? That it's not just the OEMs, it's the carriers as well, the networks, as we say in this country, who take the updates and then do just months and months of testing on them, which I suppose you could say is admirable. They don't want to push out dodgy software, and who knows what an update's going to do. A security update might patch a big security hole, but it also might create a lot of bugs. So it does make sense for them to do some pretty serious testing. But the situation we have now seems untenable to me.
I think this is all talking about the security updates only, and these are the ones that Google are rolling out every month. So if they're bringing out an update and it's taking 3 weeks or a month to get it out to the people's phones, you're sort of a month behind. The whole point of having these rolling security updates that were every month, guaranteed, meant that you could align your company's methodology with that, so you know that it's coming, and you just spit out just the security updates, not the whole ecosystem, not the whole sort of software. Sorry, So I think they should have their knuckles wrapped somewhat, because Android are trying to reduce the fragmentation and bring everyone's phones up to speed, at least on the security level, which is obviously the one that we talk about the most and is the most important. It's not that important to have the latest feature, but it is useful if you don't get your phone hacked and things like this. So Google is sort of trying to do the right thing, and it just seems like they have given... served it up as nicely as they can, and now they're maybe using a stick to chivvy people along, or chivvy these manufacturers along, to actually push those updates out. But if they do manage to make this work, you then have to wonder if they're going to sort of move over and start releasing the main operating system in the same way, and again using sticks to force companies by making them look bad.
It might have helped if they architected Android in the first place so they could do it automatically, which they chose not to get the most number of carriers and OEMs on board. So this is largely Google's problem, and it really ought to be down to them to clean up the mess.
A rod for their own back.
Very much so. That's not the only potentially dodgy design decision they made up front, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the Oracle versus Google trial, in which previously Oracle were claiming that APIs were copyrightable and won that case eventually. So it's now come back into court, and Google were arguing that they have used them, well, they're obviously claimed as being copyrightable, have used them under fair use. And on Thursday, as we record this, a federal jury concluded that the Android operating system does not infringe on those copyrights, and has agreed that the 37 uses of Java APIs is a case of fair use. So obviously they're going to appeal, which seems to be the sort of way that these trials always go. Someone makes a verdict and then whoever loses appeals. But the jury were asked one question, and that was Google's use of the Java APIs fair use under copyright? And the entire jury unanimously said yes. So it seems like they've put their case from their point of view very well and persuaded their argument quite strongly.
So my big question about this is, why should we care? It's just billion-dollar companies just paying lawyers for the sake of it, as far as I can see. It just seems to be this constant tennis match back and forth of appeal and more appeals, and it just seems to serve to line the pockets of huge law firms. The question I'm asking is, are we actually going to see any difference as consumers? Or are other companies going to see any real difference from this?
Well, I think if the finding had been in the other direction, you certainly would do, because it's now a given within that jurisdiction that APIs are copyrightable. And if there wasn't the fair use exemption there, then you wouldn't be able to use other people's APIs. You wouldn't be able to rewrite other people's APIs. And it would have a huge impact on the whole software industry.
Yeah, I just wonder about the fact that the APIs are copyrightable. And I understand that it's gone to trial, the jury made their verdict, so that's in stone. But as far as I can see, having all these APIs means that everybody's code can work together. So it seems a bit silly. What's your view on this, Paddy?
I've got to say I find the whole thing incredibly perverse. There's a good argument that APIs should be copyrightable if you subscribe to the copyright regime that we have in place, because well-written APIs aren't purely functional. If they were purely functional, then they would be outside the scope of copyright. There is creativity there to actually produce them well, but that's by the by. Currently within that jurisdiction, they are regarded as being copyrightable. So the question comes down to fair use. And I've got to say, I found the verdict really perverse, as I said. I know it won't win many friends, but I thought Oracle actually made a good case. And if you go and look at the slides that were available for Oracle's summing up at the end of the trial, I think they're incredibly persuasive that in the legal sense, they are in the right in this case. Now, everyone in the tech industry hates Oracle, and I've not seen anybody else suggesting that Oracle should have won this, apart from Florian Müller, who people don't like either very much because he's a consultant for Microsoft and Oracle. But I think people dancing on Oracle's grave in this case is really over the top, and they're allowing their dislike of Oracle as a corporation and their belief that copyright should not be applicable in this case, regardless of the legalities, to lead them to erroneous conclusions. I think Oracle actually made a good case here, and from a legal perspective should have won. I don't believe it should ever have come to trial. I don't believe that APIs or code full stop actually should be copyrightable, but that's just my opinion. But since that is the legal position, I think the jury returned the wrong verdicts in this case.
I have a horrible feeling I've just lined you up for a whole load of feedback.
Especially with the code not being copyrightable. What if you write a book, a novel? Should that not be copyrightable either?
No, I don't think copyright should exist.
Smash the system and all that. So, that's enough legal talk. I'm bored of it now. Tell us why Linux 4.6 is terrible.
Yeah, finally some straight Linux news. GR Security is a set of patches for the Linux kernel that emphasize security enhancements. And the main developer, who's called Brad Spengler, has put up a forum post over at GR Security complaining about what he sees as the Linux Foundation, and I quote, beginning a campaign to rewrite history and mislead Linux users, about some of the recent and proposed security changes in the kernel. And in particular, he singled out Greg KH for some criticism and pointed out that Greg's pronouncement that we all need to be running the latest kernels isn't necessarily the best security advice or the only security advice that you should be taking. And in contrast, Brad says, and I'm going to quote him again, I'm afraid, keeping up to date on the latest upstream kernel will generally net all the bug fixes that have been created thus far. But with it, of course, brings completely new features, new code, new bugs, and new attack surface. The majority of vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel are ones that have been released just recently, something any honest person active in kernel development can attest to. Now, I guess the point Brad's making here is that adopting a more proactive approach to security, and we've talked about this on previous shows, for example, by using some of the ideas that GR Security implements, would actually close off a whole class of possible bugs and would be a far better approach than what the kernel developers actually do at the moment, which is just sort of whack-a-mole on security bugs and not even calling them security bugs.
It sounds like an argument for the LTS kernel to me, where you just get your security patches and you don't get any new features.
Yeah, and Brad's arguing here, because that was kind of where Greg Cage was pitching things, was that even in that case, there's still whole classes of bugs available to be found and exploited in that kernel, simply because the kernel team do not take a more proactive role and implement some technologies which would stop some of these classes of bugs, if you like. And I keep stressing the word classes because there are techniques available out there that would kill some of this stuff off altogether. And the kernel team have steadfastly refused to go that way.
I did notice that throughout his entire article, he kept on saying, if you used our patches and if you used the way that we do the kernel and look at this and look at this. And I think if you have, obviously he's got a vested interest and security is one that gets a lot of headlines, but if you have a company who makes updates and patches to the kernel in order to make it faster or in order to make it more slimline or in order to make it work with the latest hardware, you could argue that, look at our patches, why aren't they doing this, why aren't they doing this? Because they have to do all of those things all over the place. Security is one segment of the kernel, but they need to be implementing all the new hardware which is coming out and make sure that it all works together. And, and there's lots and lots of different architectures that it has to run on. Of course, if you are focused on one little area, you can find fault. But there are many little areas to focus on, and that's what the kernel team is having to deal with, is this massive, great big kernel all together. So I was a little bit like, well, he does have his, one position to look at, but that is only one part of what the kernel does.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's one of the things about Spangler that rubs people the wrong way, that his sole focus is on security. And obviously, we've talked about it in the past, the kernel team try and have a trade-off between security and convenience and all the rest of it. And it is the usual question of trade-offs that we're talking about here. I don't know, though, as regards maintenance, I mean, we were talking about rods for people's own backs earlier in the news, and the kernel team have made a rod for their own back simply, again, because of the architecture of the kernel. It's kept them in jobs for many, many years, but sort of designing a monolithic kernel like this guarantees that you're always going to have these issues and it's always going to be an expanding workload. Whereas if you had a nice small little kernel, you wouldn't have that, and the kernel could have been totally bug-free by now because it had been bashed on for 15, 20 years, what have you. And if you had all the device drivers somewhere else and all the various bits of code somewhere else, but that's a totally different architecture, and it's not the one that Linus decided on. So he's got a kernel that's going to keep him work for the rest of his life and is going to provide bugs for the rest of his life.
Well, speaking of security issues, a security researcher called David Jorm has kicked up a bit of a stink lately because MITRE, who is the organization who assigns CVE numbers, that's the common vulnerabilities and exposures, has been failing to assign these CVEs to quite a lot of vulnerabilities, especially when they're being reported by people who aren't that well known. And so he has taken it into his own hands, this David Jorm fella, and started creating websites and catchy names for these vulnerabilities like Ruffle and stuff as a kind of a protest.
Yeah, we have discussed on the show whether or not having catchy names and branding helps bring people to understand that there are problems and therefore they get sorted, or whether you're just flagging up that, Linux has vulnerabilities and you'd actually rather sort of bury it a little bit. But yeah, these are not sort of major security items because they all get pushed through fairly quickly. But these are more sort of issues and bugs, like you say, that have been around for a long time or that have been brought up by sort of smaller groups and companies and individuals. Whereas one of his real sort of contentious points here is that the bigger companies, if Google brings up a bug, CVE are very quick to allocate a number and it's out in the world. So yeah, he's just sort of trying to shake up the system a little bit by bringing a different light to it, I think.
Yeah, and you've got to appreciate things from MITRE's point of view because numbers can run out, can't they? There are only a certain number of integers out there.
Yeah, of course. Well, moving on, and Canary Watch was launched a year ago, and that was by the EFF and a couple of other companies. And the idea here was to flag up when three-letter agencies had put a gagging order on companies. So it's the canary is the sort of canary in the coal mine sort of adage, and what they would do is every year or even every week or whenever they sort of had a security announcement, a company would say, we have not had a gagging order. So they'd maybe say NSA, number of gagging orders, 0. And that meant that when the NSA or some other organization sent them one of these gagging notices and required them to send over information or open up their servers or whatever, that would then change to, that would get deleted. And so it was a way of being able to see, okay, they previously had 0, now they've removed that statement, we can tell that they have had a gagging order put upon them. So they started with sort of 11 or so companies, and a year's passed, and there's now almost 70. But they're actually stopping this this sort of service because I think they have a problem with how the gagging orders, how the reporting of the gagging orders is done. Because, as I said, one website, one company may well say once a year whether or not they've had they may change their information once a year, or they may do it once a day. They might do it in plain text. It might be an HTML, a web banner. And the actual process of keeping on top of it and seeing what it is takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. And similarly, there's no way of knowing whether or not a gagging order was sent, because let's say a CEO changes and they decide that they're not going to carry on with this. They just take it off their list of announcements. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean they've had a gagging order. So it's actually quite a murky field as to A, how you record it in the first place, and B, when something does change, which is the sort of flag to say something's happened, you don't know really what's happened either. They might have just got bored of doing it. So it just sounds like it's a bit of a grey area, as that's very much come to an end.
I've always been sceptical of these canaries in the first place, because surely if the NSA or some other government agency comes in and demands access to your data and stuff and slaps you with a gagging order, part of that gagging order can be you've got to keep your canary notice there. So it just seems like a bit of a pointless endeavor, really, because you can never truly know that it's not fictitious.
No, because once you get this and you've had the gagging order, what have you, you can report that you've had a range of gagging orders in the last year. So between, I think it's 0 and 500 or something. So you never tell exactly how many it is, but you can say, or you're supposed to say, we have been requested between 0 and 500. So if you've had this canary and then the canary stays, but your number of gagging orders goes from we don't mention it to we're suddenly mentioning it, it would be sort of another red flag that you've had one.
Fair enough, but it sounds like we need a standard way to do it anyway, rather than just this scattergun approach that we've got at the moment. Someone needs to come out with a standard for it. Maybe the Linux Foundation could do that. They're not doing much at the moment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the variety, and even if you nail down the variety, it's not a clear indication that they've had one. They might have just changed their policies internally. So maybe it's not the best way of doing it either, even if there is a standard method.
Well, let's shift tack entirely and talk about hardware for a minute. And our friends at Purism are back, and they're back hitting up Indiegogo and trying to rustle up $150,000. In this case, it's to produce a couple of Linux-powered tablets. Now, I really don't want to bother going through the specs. I mean, you two can dive into that if you wish, but I don't really trust the company to actually deliver in this case. And I'm clearly not alone in that. The crowdfunding campaign's only attracted 12 backers so far.
Well, they are two of the most expensive tablets I think I've ever seen. When I first read this, I thought it was a 10-inch and a 13-inch, I think. And I thought they were laptops. And I looked at the price, yep, okay, $600 and $1,000, that seems reasonable. And you go back up and you realise that, no, it's a tablet, and that's some pricey tablets.
It's a 10-inch and 11-inch, to be clear, and they're designed to compete with the Microsoft Surface, and they are incredibly expensive tablets, so it's kind of in that price range. But I think that you might be right, Jesse, that it is more a pragmatic case of these things are too expensive, why would we want them, rather than we don't trust the company, because they did somewhat deliver some hardware. It was overpriced. It didn't have the free BIOS that was promised, or EFI, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't totally free software, and they've pivoted, as I think is the phrase these days, away from the kind of open source or free software aspect of it, more towards privacy with the hardware kill switches and stuff. But it is a surprise that it's had so few backers to me. They did so well last time. How can they be doing so badly this time? I suppose it's just too expensive. That's the bottom line here.
I think it's Paddy's point on delivery. So they said they would get this laptop out, the Librem 13 and the 15, and they took months and months and months to come out. And even when they did, they weren't actually delivering what they said they would, as you touched on there, Joe, with the BIOS. And so it doesn't really, you can't then have a second release and expect that all the backers who liked your laptop would then jump on board with the tablet.
Who liked the idea of the laptop.
Yeah, exactly. So if they've switched from entirely open source and open software, and now they're sort of pitching it more at privacy and making sure that your credentials online are kept safe and things like this through open software, it's not the same pitch, is it? So maybe they've realized, well, it looks like it's not one that's going to work. So they've not delivered well. They've, as you say, Joe, pivoted and come up with something that is a bit of a losing campaign.
And also the fact that this is going to run GNOME shell, which on the face of it looks like a touch-friendly desktop environment, but in reality, I think it's the kind of thing that can be somewhat augmented. Your experience can be somewhat augmented by touch, but you do fundamentally need to have a mouse or touchpad with it at the same time. And I think that Linux, full-blown Linux on a tablet, hasn't taken off because it doesn't really work, does it? Whereas Android is designed around touch, and that's why that's been massively successful on touch devices.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. And you mentioned the pivot, and it is a very clear pivot from free and open source to caring about privacy, supposedly. But nonetheless, they're still attempting to show that they care about open firmware, and they've launched a petition to encourage Intel to produce a CPU without the management engine, and that's up on their website at the moment.
What's that thing you do into the wind that we can't talk about? It's never going to happen, is it? Am I being too negative here, or is there any possible way that Intel are going to release processors that don't require blobs? I mean, it's just not going to happen.
I think it's a question of scale, isn't it? I mean, last time I looked at this petition, there was something like 400 odd signatures on it, and I don't think Intel are going to be too bothered if 400 people are a bit grumpy with them.
Although, if you think about it, Intel are losing market share to ARM, and gradually that transition over from x86 to ARM is happening, and they can't ignore that. But if they could kind of pitch themselves as a company that cares about privacy and security and open source, then maybe that could be the angle that might let them ride this out a little bit longer. Or is that wishful thinking that enough people actually care about that stuff to make it a viable business option?
Well, sort of combining that question and Paddy's point is that those 400 people, if they are, purism advocates and backers of the Librem, they would have bought an Intel chip anyway, so it doesn't really matter. They're still buying their products.
Yeah, I suppose. Well, Purism's trying to sell these tablets on Indiegogo, and Indiegogo have announced, as they say, they're improving crowdfunding with the stamp of approval for hardware projects. Now, that's not how I see this. So what this is to me is they're teaming up with a company called Arrow Electronics, who are going to help out people who want to sell hardware on Indiegogo or want to have hardware campaigns. So Purism would be an ideal company to team up with them. And Arrow Electronics will help with all sorts of aspects of it, from design to manufacturing and logistics and that kind of thing. But this is a paid service, isn't it? We're talking about Indiegogo. I don't want to use the word backhanders, but let's say corporate synergy with Arrow Electronics.
I mean, you just did.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so corporate synergy, anyway, with Arrow Electronics to have people get this stamp of approval and create a two-tiered system on Indiegogo. So are you paying Arrow Electronics for this kind of mark of approval and vote of confidence, or are you going it alone? So I don't know, Indiegogo's traditionally been, I don't know, in my head, a little bit less dodgy than Kickstarter, but this doesn't look good for them to me.
So I see you've given it the sort of, this is where it's coming from Indiegogo's point of view, and maybe they've done a fair way of looking at it, and who is the best company to provide this service, or maybe they've already had them, been in bed with them before. I'm not really sure, but from a purely investor's point of view, if there's someone who's got this pie in the sky idea that sounds amazing, you never have any idea how they're going to deliver that. You don't know if they've got any background in it, whether they've got any knowledge of manufacturing, or how they can make the cheapest container for whatever it is they're going to build, or where they're going to source the parts. And you just sort of hope that while someone might have this amazing idea, they're also a design entrepreneur at the same time. And I don't think they often are, and this is where a lot of them fall down. So from an investor's point of view, I can see the benefit in this. I can see why you would want it, because if Joe Bloggs suddenly says, well, I've got this great idea, there's a company who know what they're doing, who are going to help me with this thing that I've never done before, I would therefore feel more comfortable investing in that, because they have put some effort into finding a partner. Now, you're right, it does produce a two-tier system, but that's Indiegogo's problem.
Well, we'll see if this actually takes off, how many of the manufacturers actually feel that they need to pay for help. Because if I was going to go to Indiegogo, by the time I got to that point where I was going to launch my campaign, I would hope that I would have done the necessary research and lined up deals with, or at least, got quotes from manufacturers and stuff. I just think that a lot of companies, especially the kind of startup companies that go to Indiegogo, have got enough confidence and enough bravado to not really need stuff like this. So we'll just have to see how many actually go for them, and whether or not this badge of approval becomes important, really, or whether it becomes just a sort of the opposite, a badge of, well, you need help, therefore you don't actually know what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think you're right. I mean, you're clearly conscientious enough to say, I would make sure that I knew what I was doing before I put myself up to be laughed at and not deliver. But it sounds like, taking that point, I do think that Kickstarter and Indiegogo should do a better job of checking the credentials of someone who is saying, I want £10,000 for this. Well, do you have any plan on how you're going to get that? Do you have any idea we're going to source the motherboard, the components, this or that? Because they currently, just as far as I can see, have an open door, and anyone can ask for anything. If this was Dragon's Den, you wouldn't be able to ask for £1 million without any kind of backup as to what you're doing, or ask for 20 quid just because you want to go and buy a hot dog. There's no real sort of filter on there, is there?
Well, and that's rather the point, isn't it? They don't care. Indiegogo and Kickstarter and the like don't really care what happens. They get their money regardless.
Yeah, and to go against my earlier point, the first successful crowdfunding that uses this service but doesn't deliver, the entire service is null and void. If you are expecting this to come, once you've put your money and it's got the stamp of approval, you expect that to be delivered. And when it doesn't, if it doesn't, it's going to have no worth whatsoever.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Yeah, the first failed one, and then that's it, curtains. So, they hopefully, well, you would have thought that Arrow Electronics would choose wisely, but you never know. They might just be in it for the money, and it might backfire spectacularly.
Well, sticking tenuously with Indiegogo, Yola, who had previously released their tablet on Indiegogo, and we discussed previously the problems they've had with it and the fact they're giving refunds and things. Selfish OS and Yola have come out with a community device program. So for those of you who are not up to speed, Yola is the company, a Finnish company of ex-Nokia engineers who took MeeGo and sort of squeezed it into Sailfish. And it's effectively, one of its USPs is that it's sort of running almost pure Linux, and it also can run Android apps. So we reviewed it in, I think, 64. So you can listen to our discussion on the original Sailfish phone, but this community device program is, well, unfortunately, there's 1,000 places and they've already all sold out. But to quote Yola, the new Sailfish community device program is for all who want to be in the front line advocating or developing the platform and a more open future. And the idea is that you're, a developer for Sailfish, or you're one of these people who goes out and says good things about it and uses it and sends bug reports and all these sorts of things. And what you get with this community program is the Yola C, which is a brand new phone that they've brought out, support sessions and materials so you can help. It helps you as a developer, and also you get invitations to events and things. And it's only €170 to join. But as I said, there's only 1,000 places, and from what I've seen, they've all been sold out already.
€170 for a phone and some resources, and that phone has no warranty because they're not selling you a phone either. They've got around this EU 2-year warranty business by saying that it's a community program and you happen to get the free phone with your membership or something. It seems to me, I'm being very cynical today, but I suppose that's normal. It seems to me anyway that this is just a way to sell phones and not worry about supporting them in the future.
Yeah, but they can't be selling a phone for €170. It's a 5-inch HD screen and a replaceable battery, quad core, 2GB of RAM. It's not going to set the world alight, but it certainly is a very competent phone. So I think €170 is a fairly low price for it.
Yeah, I tend to side with Jesse here, actually, and think you're being unduly negative, Joe, because I thought this was quite a positive thing for Yola to actually do. And I also was curious as to what your take on it was for the wider community. I mean, this is exactly the sort of thing I think Canonical should have done, rather than shoving out devices and claiming they're consumer-facing devices when they clearly weren't, both on the phone side and also with the recently and fairly much maligned M10.
Yeah, I suppose if you look at it that way, you're right. It is a good idea to put it out as a community project. And that's what I said about the M10. That's what they should have done, yeah. But at the same time, who is going to invest? Well, 1,000 people, but you'd be, I don't want to say you'd be an idiot, but it's certainly not something I would do, to invest in your time and money into a company which is on its last legs, or at least seemingly is on its last legs. I just don't see what the attraction is for developers. I just think there are 1,000 people who are like, oh, cool, a new toy. And it's only €170 or whatever. Whereas if you're really serious about developing for that platform, there isn't really enough of a platform to develop for. At least with Ubuntu, you've got convergence and you've got these hundreds of thousands, millions maybe, of desktop users who are eventually probably going to end up on Unity 8. So you've got that goal to work towards. Whereas Sailfish as a platform is a bit dead end to me.
I think their allocation of 1,000 places is quite low. It's quite a small number if you say that half of them are, as you say, enthusiasts or community people who aren't going to be doing hard developing for it. And also the fact that it was just sort of an open question, who wants it. I think they would have been much better off identifying, key people who have been supporting them and said, right, you 600 people will get one, and we've got a few more that we can sell out to the wider community. I think I agree with Paddy's point that this is a good way of getting developers on board, getting hardware in their hands and allowing them to bash on it. But I think they should have been even more specific in, saying, right, this guy's written an app or has sent us bug reports. He's worthy of being invited onto the program. However, I haven't heard anything from Yola since the failure of their tablet and the fact they've had to send a few of them out and then give everyone else a refund. And now this seems to sort of come out of the blue. They've got this Yola C. I'm not really sure, who makes it or where it's coming from. It does leave a lot of questions. I agree, Joe.
Oh, I don't know. It's a strange state of affairs when I'm the positive one on the show, but I'm positive about this. And as I say, I think it's a good model that other companies perhaps should adopt. Canonical, I am looking at you specifically. Well, let's wrap up the news then finally with the story that Mycroft Core has finally appeared. And Ryan Sipes, when we were speaking to him recently, said this was going to happen, and it usually has. I'm not really sure there's a great deal to add, is there?
No, not really. It's out there. People can now hack on it. They can get it running. It's not particularly easy to get running. I looked at it and thought, let me see. And then I started reading into how to get it installed, and I thought, I don't really have time to do that, I'm afraid, not right now. But I think that there was a lot of interest in this coming out, and now it's there. People can hack on it, and it seems like a very big milestone for Mycroft and the company as a whole, and hopefully they can continue working on it, and we'll actually get a decent competitor to the Amazon Echo and Google's new air freshener thing.
Yeah, and it's great to see a company actually delivering when they said they're going to as well. And I can't remember if I said actually at the time when we were talking to Ryan, I found his enthusiasm really infectious. And prior to talking with him, I was somewhat dubious. And afterwards, I was somewhat dubious. But at the time, I was very much taken with the whole idea of Mycroft. So well done, guys. It's out and it's there for people to use.
Right, that'll do it for the news then. Let's move on. We often talk about backups on this show and good backup practices. And one key aspect of decent backup solutions is off-site storage, off-site backups. And the leading, I think it's fair to say, the leading company in this space is Dropbox. Drive from Google is something of a competitor. And of course, OwnCloud has come along because people are worried about entrusting their data to the cloud, and they're worried what happens with it once it leaves their computer and goes to someone else's computer. Now, you, Paddy, have been using Dropbox and various solutions for quite some time, haven't you? But you don't trust them to not look at your data, so you have always encrypted it. And so, first of all, let's just have a brief discussion of the fairly complex way that you do that.
I don't think it's that complex, but I guess it could be for a non-technical user. I fundamentally use two different technologies. I use NKFS as an encrypted file system. We've spoken about that on the show previously, and there's been some security concerns over it, but it seems to do the job perfectly well for me. And also GPG for encrypting some files and some tar archives symmetrically, and that seems to work quite happily as well. It works for me, and I'll stick a link for how to do the NKFS setup on Linux in the show notes because it's relatively straightforward. But what really prompted this segment was it's relatively straightforward for those of us who are a little bit technical, but I don't think it's something you just suggest a relative go and look at and implement themselves. I'm aware there's a variety of other encrypted file systems out there, and they're equally awkward to set up from a non-technical perspective. And I was wondering if there was something perhaps that was slightly simpler that you could just say to a friend or relative, here you go and use that, and it's all transparent. And I came across this thing called Cryptomator.
Sorry, so just before we go on to Cryptomator, can I ask, Paddy, do you think that the difficulty with your current version or your current system and other encrypted file systems is that it's all on the command line, whereas Cryptomator is a GUI?
I think it is, yeah, largely. I mean, I've got a little bash script that with an icon sat in my taskbar, which I click, and if my encrypted file system isn't mounted, it prompts for a password and mounts it. If it is mounted, it dismounts it. And it's really easy to use, but I've had to write a tiny little bash script to do that. And if you're suggesting to Joe Public, who knows nothing about how any of this stuff works, that probably would be a little bit beyond them.
Well, that's me, Joe Public, isn't it? And it's not beyond me, but it's beyond my patience, I suppose, to bother with it. Whereas Cryptomator, or we need to decide, is it Cryptomator or is it Cryptometer? It doesn't really matter, does it? Cryptomator, let's go with that. It's just so easy. There's almost nothing to talk about here because it's basically a really simple GUI that allows you to create a vault, as they call it, which is essentially just a folder directory. And when you set it up, you put in the password that you want for it. And then you just drag and drop your stuff into that folder. And then you can set that folder to sync up to Dropbox or Drive. Well, not Drive, I suppose, because there's no Linux client for it, but certainly with Dropbox. And it's just as simple as that.
Yeah, there's no official Drive client. You could use Drive, or you could actually pay for InSync if you wanted to.
Yeah, when you say you set it up, you mean the way I did it was I saved that vault within my Dropbox folder and then it auto backs up. That's what you mean, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things about Cryptomator is it doesn't attempt to do too much. All they're interested in is the actual encryption and decryption. They don't worry about transport and things. They leave all that to the original clients for these bits of software, whether it's Drive or Dropbox or what have you. So they're focusing on one particular thing and allowing the original programmers to do all the rest of it. And I think that's a really good call.
Yeah, very much the Linux way. I do want to just have a quick plug for my previous discussion on the last show about using Antergos, because
Anterg OS, isn't it?
it's Anterg OS, absolutely, yeah. Cryptomator. Anyway, so there's deb files you can download and there's RPMs you can download, or you can build from source. And I didn't really want to fancy that. Looked on the AUR, there it is, bish bash bosh, installed. So win for me. However, I did quite like on Cryptomator, that when I load it up now, the AUR has version 1.0.5, but the latest is 1.1.0, and so straight away on the very simple GUI that it has, it says version 1.1 can be downloaded. You're running an old version, so it even prompts you that you should be keeping up to speed with this.
Yeah, for completeness, I guess we ought to mention not only is it available for Linux, it's also on Windows and available for the Mac as well. iOS apparently is supported. There's a client for that, but the Android one isn't available yet.
And it's a permissive license as well, isn't it?
It is, yes. It's under the MIT.
Oh, so that makes you happy.
It does indeed, yeah. It's the best thing you can have, short of having no copyright on it at all.
Well, I'm also happy because it has a graph. So when you put folders and files into your vault, it shows you the graph of the megabits per second of performing the encryption, and then when you pull them back out again, of unencrypting them. So it shows you how it's churning through, and when you put a thumping great ISO image in there, it plows through it for an amount of time, whereas if you just dump a doc in there, it's done in seconds. So it's quite nice just seeing that sort of information. And once you've made your vault, you've put all your files in it, what have you, and you relock it, it looks like gobbledygook when you go to your system. And you can have multiple vaults, which are all can be labeled and renamed within the GUI. And there's like a little red dot or a little green dot as to whether or not you've got that locked or unlocked, so you can see which ones are open and what you're using. So as I say, it's very simple, and as you say, Paddy, does one thing and does it well.
The only criticism I have of this is...
Here we go.
No, it's a fairly minor criticism, but I think they could work on this. Let's face it, this is for backups. So the reality is, if you need to then pull back down your vault from the cloud onto your newly restored system, you need to be able to open existing vaults, which you can do, but it doesn't make it 100% clear what exactly you need to open, because you browse to the folder that you think is the vault and then nothing happens. And so you have to actually select the key file in order to open that vault. And me being a little bit thick, it took me, 2 or 3 minutes to work that out, I'm ashamed to say. Whereas if it had been a bit clearer about that, I could have done that instantly. And in that situation, you're pretty desperate, aren't you? You're desperately trying to get your data back. Your hard drive's died, and now it's, right, I need to sign into Dropbox and pull my stuff down. And, at that point, you could be really stressed and just not work it out, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think you're being particularly thick. I think it's actually a slight design issue. It's a UI issue that they need to sort out, because it wasn't entirely clear to me the first time I did it either. And the same thing goes for when you're creating new vaults. That didn't work quite as I expected. As I say, it's a UI issue. But while we're talking about the UI, I was surprised somewhat. Jesse thought the graph was a good idea, because I thought that was just fluff. And it reminded me of the conversation we had about SyncThing recently, where I think we all agreed that all the extra garbage and all the reporting that was available in the GUI was actually just a distraction.
This does make you feel like it's grinding through some good cryptography. Gives that sort of representation. And isn't that the point of this? Is to make you feel like it's been encrypted? I mean, did any of us look at the code and make sure that the various methods they've used are being used properly? No.
No, we didn't. But as we mentioned earlier, it is only doing this one thing. So there's a relatively small amount of code there. So I'm sure somebody could come along and audit it. They haven't so far. It's been subject to feedback, shall I say, on Reddit. And they've taken some good ideas from the guys on Reddit who have poked holes in a variety of things. But there's been no official audit yet. And I guess we should have mentioned up front, because we've gone through this whole conversation here without actually saying how it works. Encrypts things and decrypts things and then presents them using WebDAV as a local drive. So on Windows, you can assign a drive letter to your actual vault, and on Linux, it obviously just opens up as a separate drive that's mounted all of a sudden and available via WebDAV.
Yeah, and so on the back end, it's using AES encryption with a 256-bit keys and script key derivation, which I have to admit I'm not familiar with.
Well, it's quite important that key derivation isn't straightforward, because if you can use a process that makes it slow or relatively slow, then if somebody is trying to crack that key derivation, then it's going to slow them down. If you're having to wait like half a second for something to happen when you type your key in, that's fair enough. But if someone's trying to crack it, half a second times a billion attempts soon adds up. So script is an algorithm specifically designed to be slow. So it's quite a useful thing that it uses it.
Yeah, script's the underlying algorithm behind Litecoin, and that's what makes it different from Bitcoin, isn't it? But it's good to see that they've built this on existing technologies. They've not tried to just invent it themselves. They know that cryptography is incredibly difficult, and there's decent open source implementations available. So they've basically just put that together into a nice GUI and made something that's really easy for pretty much anyone to use. I think it could do with a bit of development. It's not quite ready for, the relatives and people who are total technophobes. But I think certainly for the likes of me, it's absolutely ideal.
Yep, sounds like it's a general all-round Luddite thumbs up.
On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to our monthly supporters. It really is appreciated, everyone. It helps us keep the servers going and keep the lights on and all that stuff.
Yeah, and while it might not actually make a lot of difference to the sound, I think we've discussed previously that I was experimenting with stand-up desks and things, and my last iteration was a laptop on a box with my mic next to that, and it was a bit sort of cumbersome and awkward and difficult to do, and heaven forbid I touched the box during a recording. And so with the money that we've got, I've been able to buy a proper mic stand, so I can now stand up and the mic's the right level, but also more importantly, a monitor stand that lifts the monitor from normal desk height all the way up to eye line when you're stood. So I've got my full PC rather than a laptop at eye level with a mic, all nicely standing, and it's all more elegant and more easier to set up and things. So thank you very much. It means that while the audio quality is the same as it was, the actual process of recording is more comfortable and everything. So these are the sorts of things that go on behind the scenes.
I don't know what's wrong with you wanting to stand up for hours on end doing this.
It's nice to get to sort of stroll about, and with a Bluetooth pair of headphones, I can sort of amble about while you two are arguing about something.
Fair enough. Okay, so contact details. You can email us, show@linuxluddites.com, or if you go to the website, there's links to Twitter, which is @linuxluddites, and there's a Facebook community and a Google Plus community, and of course you can always leave a comment on the website.
Let's kick off the feedback proper then with a comment from Aaron B. And Aaron said, "This comment is based on two issues you brought up in your last podcast, ad blockers and the dropping of support by Debian for non-686 class CPUs. Here in the US, newspapers are being bought by big media companies, and all have increased the amount of advertisements at the same time. This means my 4-year-old laptop with a dual-core Intel Pentium processor can be brought to its knees with some highly advertised and tracked sites, which has forced me to use uBlock Origin. So if my 4-year-old laptop struggles with the multimedia that's out there on some websites, how could a 386 keep up?"
Well, I don't think there's going to be any 386s or 486s running a desktop, really. There's certainly nothing of of any weight. I think Debian running on those really old processors are more for servers and, that kind of thing, headless. But it is a good point that it is horrible to browse the web on even an i3, really, if you don't use AdBlock. It's not even necessarily about just not wanting to see adverts. It's just about all the bloat that comes with them.
Yeah, every time we talk about bloat on websites, I always think of The Verge and the number of things that pop up and churn, and it just takes ages to get to the thing you want to look at. It's really annoying. So I fully understand Aaron B's point there.
Here's a handy hint. There is nothing worth looking at on The Verge.
Ooh. Oh, but it's all so hipster and new. How can I not look?
I swear you've linked many times to Verge articles, Paddy, you hypocrite.
Yeah, I must admit I do occasionally, because sometimes there are odd stories there. But I never go to the website. I get it all via RSS, so I'm not subjected to this horrific experience that Jesse's sort of explaining.
I usually look at it on my phone, on my tablet, and it's not that bad. But anyway, let's move on. Ian Barton said, I update my Linode server running Arch weekly, but haven't rebooted it for many months. After all, that's one of Linux's USPs. You don't need to keep rebooting it. Anyway, for some reason I decided to reboot it, and I could no longer SSH into it. I found that the root file system had been mounted read-only, so restored the previous night's backup only to find the same problem. Exactly the same happened with the backup from the week before too. After much Googling, I found a post which identified the problem in FSTab and fixed it. The problem had probably existed on my system for months, but only caused an error when rebooting. So should you reboot your system after updating to try and uncover problems like this early? And the answer to that is yes, I reboot my system all the time, and even my server, especially when it needs to be rebooted after kernel stuff. And I think it's good practice. If you don't reboot it for ages and ages, then if the power goes out or something and then it comes back up. We talked about that with live kernel patching and how that just seemed to be a terrible idea. I think that people like to brag about uptime, but not me. I reboot frequently.
Yeah, I like to reboot because I'm incredibly smug when all the scripts that I've written work. And I just like the fact that happens. Is that a valid reason to reboot?
Yeah, I think that's as good a reason as any. And on an Ubuntu system, I'm not sure about Debian, but certainly on Ubuntu, if you look at, I think it's var/run/reboot-required, either that file doesn't exist or it's just a text file saying system restart required or something. And so that's quite a good way to see whether you need to reboot or not. And I think I did. I sent that into Ubuntu Podcast as a command line love. So if you hear it there, well, you heard it here first, hopefully.
Talking about rebooting, am I right in saying that the new systemd update that's coming is going to stop all user processes? And that means that, so when you log out, or maybe it's not quite the same as rebooting, is it? So, but when you log out, it will stop all the running processes for that user, which includes things like screen and tmux. Have you heard about this?
Yes, and you're correct. They've changed the default from being leave stuff running to turn it all off. And I think that just clearly illustrates something we've talked about in the past, which is that their focus is on the desktop and they come with that mindset to everything. I mean, if you're running a server, you want processes to carry on. I can understand on the desktop, potentially you don't, and it's good to keep things cleaned up after people do log off. But on a server, you certainly want to leave processes running that were started in that session.
Yeah, I feel there's going to be some more thorny sort of responses to systemd once again. Anyway, moving on, Robert Horn got in touch and said, for years now I've dealt with my need for Unix tools on Windows using Cygwin. It doesn't get a lot of use on my corporate Windows machine, but I do get SSH, LFTP, SCP, rsync, tar, git, bash, and other basics that way.
Well, my understanding is that it's a much deeper integration into the Windows system. You've got the Linux subsystem for Windows, I think they call it, and it's actually talking directly to the kernel. So that the commands that you are running and the processes that are happening are actually talking to the Windows kernel directly through this subsystem, whereas Cygwin is much less integrated, isn't it?
Yeah, Cygwin provides a DLL which sort of exposes some POSIX-style API functionality to you. I mean, if you look at the Cygwin website, front page, it says, what isn't it? And it says, Cygwin is not a way to run native Linux apps on Windows. You must rebuild your application from source if you want to run on Windows. And that isn't the case with the Windows subsystem for Linux that we're talking about here. You can take a native ELF binary from Linux and run it on Windows as it stands.
Well, that's certainly the goal of it. It's a bit ropey at the moment, but I'm sure once they develop it a bit further, then yeah, you basically be able to run most binaries on Windows.
Yeah, so I guess the difference really is that the new system will allow sort of transparent portability between the two environments, whereas with Cygwin, you're having to recompile everything and make special allowances for the environment you're in.
But in terms of as a user, it's not going to be hugely different, is it? If you're only using a certain set of tools, if you're not trying to compile binaries and stuff.
I guess it depends what you're trying to do, because surely as a user, a lot of the time you're going to be sucking down packages from the web, and if they're pre-compiled binaries, then it's good to know they're going to work straight out of the box rather than you having to get the source code and recompile. So, yeah, I guess it depends on your use case, really, but it's quite a different sort of setup from Cygwin.
Yeah, it sounds like Robert here has a number of command line tools that he uses. They all work through Cygwin. So there's no great benefit in moving over to the sort of Ubuntu Bash system on Windows. But if there was a greater number of programs that he needs or ones that he's wanted to run, this sounds like the way.
Let's stay talking about Ubuntu on Windows for a minute. And Floyd Wallace got in touch and he said that he thought my fears on the abandonment of the Linux desktop were unwarranted. And Floyd says, if anything, I can see Microsoft offering its own branded version of a Linux desktop with the help of Canonical.
I don't think that's going to happen. Famous last words. I think that they only need to integrate enough of the stuff that they need. They don't need to roll out a whole distribution for it. Why would they have spent so long developing this subsystem when, if they've got plans to actually have a proper Linux distro? Because it wouldn't be very difficult for them to basically take Ubuntu and rebadge it with Microsoft branding. I mean, that's what half of DistroWatch is, isn't it? So if they were going to do that, surely they would have done it by now, not spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably millions, developing this subsystem. So I'm not having it that they're actually going to do that. I don't think they need to.
Yeah, I'd agree entirely with you. I mean, the whole point is to keep them in a Windows environment, no matter that it's got Linuxy bits stuck on the side, to encourage them to use things that are only available within a Windows environment and eventually push everything towards Azure, but that's by the by. Anyhow, Floyd carried on. For developers locked into Windows at work, the Ubuntu shell will let them run Rails environments within Windows without the hassle of dual booting. But many developers increasingly work remotely on their own machines, and price for performance is a sensitive budget issue. As an example, here in the US, it takes somewhere between $600 to $800 for a reasonable Windows computer. Meanwhile, you can buy a perfectly reasonable cheap computer for about $240 and simply throw a low-resource Linux distro on it. There you have a fairly responsive machine at less than half the cost of a pure Windows environment.
So my approach to buying expensive items is how often do I use it and has this money been invested? So I have a PC, I bought a laptop, it was secondhand off eBay, it was about £100 and I mess about on my laptop, I do things for the show and what have you. I'm not a developer, I don't code on it all day long, but if you are doing those things and that was me, I would be paying the good money to get a good piece of hardware. And if I'm used to a Windows environment and that good hardware comes with a usable Windows 10, that's what I would have. I don't think I'd be looking to sort of scrimp and save here and there. And I understand, like you say, not everyone is flush with $800. But if it is something that you're using every single day to do your job, it's not something that I think you should be scrimping on. For the show, we've got good quality microphones and we've paid a premium for them. But I think the result is that the money is well spent in the end product. So I agree that you can get cheap computers, but I think that would only be for someone who doesn't use their computer very often, is the way I would look at this.
Yeah, I'd also question the argument that Linux is necessarily lighter than Windows anyway. I mean, I was slightly shocked by your comment last show, Joe, when you sort of went down the usual Windows bashing route. I see a lot of it out there, and I think it comes from people who don't or haven't run Windows for a long time. I mean, the box I'm talking to you on now is an old ThinkPad. It's an X200. It's running Windows 10 and it's running Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is one of the lighter desktops, obviously, out there. And pound for pound, I would say they run about identically in performance. Now, Windows 10 uses slightly more memory and it's a hell of a lot slower to start up and shut down. But when it's actually going, I don't really notice any difference between the two operating systems.
Is that not a testament to your administration skills, that you have turned off unnecessary services and have tweaked it? Or are you talking about a basically out-of-the-box Windows 10 experience?
This is Windows 10 out of the box, apart from with Classic Shell, because I can't abide the tiled menu, so it's just got a standard menu now.
But other than that, you haven't tweaked it to make it more performant?
I've done absolutely nothing to it now.
Because my experience, I say recently, I don't know, about 6 months ago, set up a Windows 7 desktop machine. And that Windows 7 desktop machine was far more powerful than any computer I have got. And I've got, I haven't got anything super powerful. And installing and configuring Windows 7 on it was an absolute nightmare. Whereas I know that Linux on it would have been much, much quicker. So it might be that Windows 10 is much faster, but I have experimented with Windows 10 on my test laptop because I wanted to see the Ubuntu stuff working. And for my money, I'm sticking with it. Reasonably lightweight Linux, like Ubuntu, is much faster than Windows in my experience, even Windows 10. But then again, I don't really use Windows 10 very much. I've only experimented with it. I've never actually used it at work and stuff like you do. So I suppose I've got to take your word on that. But it's certainly not been my limited experience of Windows.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is, even if there's a small difference, I don't think it's a question of 2 or 3 times as much hardware needs to be thrown at it, which is the point Floyd was trying to make.
Yeah, and when you step up from 240 to 800, you're paying for things like a metal exterior, a high-definition webcam, high-resolution screen and things, which are not impacted by the operating system it's running. It's the niceties of what you're touching and looking at. Just rounding off the feedback, on Google+, Ian Barton got in touch about how to clone Arch. Now, it's been on my little list of things to chat about at the intro, so I know Paddy will be happy to get this off. But I've always wondered how you clone a Raspberry Pi SD card, because I often want to have multiple versions of exactly what I've just made. And so if anyone is interested in cloning Arch or Raspberry Pi cards and things, Ian Barton's got a nice little list of steps and commands. You sort of basically tar it and then untar it. And so go and look on our Google Plus page and all the information will be there.
Right, that'll do it for the feedback then. Let's move on to Over a Pint. We haven't had an Over a Pint for a while, so let's talk about net neutrality. So this is a very complicated issue in my head. I remember years and years and years ago when this first was brought up, it just seemed like an absolute no-brainer to me. You pay for an internet connection, and so you pay for a certain speed and either a certain amount of data or unlimited, and your ISP should therefore treat your connection equally no matter what you are sending over that connection, sending or receiving. It should be totally blind to it and just deliver you that speed and that much bandwidth.
You're talking about dumb pipes.
Yes, exactly. Your connection should be a dumb pipe. And that just, when I first heard about this, seemed absolutely logical, and anything else would just be totally unfair. But then Netflix came along and started sending out huge amounts of data to its customers and cost ISPs and people who run network switches and that kind of thing a lot of money to serve this bandwidth, and made millions of dollars off the back of that. And people started to say, well, this isn't on. Companies who are serving content to a very small number of people relatively on an ISP's network are being subsidized by everyone else who has higher bills as a result of that. Now, I get the feeling that you two are opposite ends of this spectrum, And I am seriously on the fence about this. And the reason that I wanted to talk about it was I wanted to be convinced either way. I want to finally have an opinion and not be a fence sitter. So I'm guessing that, Paddy, you are against net neutrality, and Jesse, you are for it. So who wants to go first? Right, Jesse, argue the case for it.
That's quite a big totem you've put me on. But let's say a lot of the benefit we have from the internet is because anyone can serve up internet content, and it has just as much likelihood of being seen and being used by the people who are looking at the internet as anything else. So if something is popular because of its content, its worth, let's say. But if there's some sort of inconsistency in the way in which that content is served to you, so one of the big issues with net neutrality and not having net neutrality is the fact that the big companies will be able to pay in order to get on what they often refer to as fast lanes, whereas the smaller companies or startups or people who have just got a good idea will be on, big air quotes, the slow lane. And part of the neutralizing factor, the thing that brings people to one consistent position on the internet is that all content is served up and delivered equally. And so if you've got a great idea, you're not being held back just because you can't afford to get on the faster side. People can get your content just the same. So it's a balancing force which everyone has used, and everyone, all the big internet companies and all of the big websites and things have made the most of that. And they'll be able to afford to stay on the fast lane if a fast lane comes in. But the startups, the people with new ideas, won't. And so they'll be unfairly pushed down, despite the fact that in a neutral internet, they would have the same ability to be served up at the same speed as everyone else and play with the big boys.
But you say if a fast lane comes in, and fast lanes exist already. I mean, I don't entirely agree with your metaphor, but let's go with it for a minute. People like Google and Netflix have servers and peering arrangements with ISPs all over the place that your startup who has a couple of boxes on DigitalOcean won't have. So they already have better access to the network and closer to the client access than a startup would have anyway. So they are already in a privileged position, and that net neutrality you're talking about doesn't exist today.
But it still has to come through the ISP. So I know what you're saying. They've got servers within the ISP, and so their ping time and their round trips are a lot shorter. But the piece of cable or wire or fiber that comes to your door is still coming from your ISP, and your ISP has their hand on that throttle. So yes, they've gone out of their way, Netflix and Google and the other big companies have gone out of their way to have servers inside the ISPs to minimize the amount of time that it takes to respond. But if something becomes bigger and the ISP, they haven't paid the ISP the tax or whatever you want to call it, the ISP still has the authority and the ability to turn that down. And so you're no longer having this neutral platform that everyone can play from.
I guess why I'm struggling a little bit is you're saying it as if there is a neutral platform there, and there never has been a neutral platform on the internet. There's always been traffic shaping back from the very first days of ARPANET, even when, say, Education Network was connected into ARPANET. Traffic was allowed in and out of it, but traffic wasn't allowed through it to get to different sites. So the sort of traffic shaping has always been present, and it continues today. I mean, the idea that net neutrality is something we've got to cherish and protect is a complete fallacy, because it's something we've never actually had.
So if we've never had it, is it possible that we could have it? Is it something that we should fight towards rather than to preserve, but to actually get in the first place?
Okay, well, the classic argument you'll hear from people for not having it is something along the lines of, don't you want priority traffic for instance, surgeons doing operations? And that's a bit cliched, but if you're doing something like that over TCP/IP, do you really want the surgeon's view of an operation, a remote operation, to be interrupted by someone's Netflix stream.
But wouldn't the surgeon have paid for a data allowance, a speed allowance big enough to provide them the data equally? So, I mean, if they are having a certain amount of information being pumped into the hospital, of which half is required to be this surgeon's, remote kind of surgery. If that starts getting eaten up because other things in the hospital are using the bandwidth, they should be buying a bigger pipe.
Yeah, but it's not other things in the hospital. Your argument was it's the ISP level that we ought to be thinking about net neutrality, and that's the only bit we can talk about and sensibly control, any legislation ought to sensibly control. And other users of that ISP will be watching Netflix or what have you, and they would be quite capable of drowning out the signal for the surgeon. I mean, you could suggest that the surgeon goes and buys a separate pipe onto the internet full stop and doesn't go via an ISP. But then again, you're eating away your basic argument.
Well, surely if the surgeon in the hospital has paid for, 1 gigabit download, they'll get a gigabit of information coming to them. And assuming that the information from the remote surgery that's going on is less than that, why would they not have it at full speed? They've got a huge, great big pipe. They have paid for a certain amount of information per second, and if that information per second is not being met by the ISP, then the ISP is unfairly charging them.
So what you're saying is that the ISP needs to upgrade their infrastructure in order to be able to deal with Netflix and the surgeon. But the question is, who's going to pay for that? Should it be Netflix or should it be the users, the customers? And so we're back to that question of, should people be subsidizing other people? Or if you're a Netflix user, should you be paying more than someone who's just does a bit of casual browsing?
Well, you already do. So when we start up this recording, we're all doing it remotely. We're doing it on Skype. I make sure that my flatmate isn't about to start watching HD content and sucking up all my bandwidth so that the conversation that we have can be free-flowing and as lag-free as possible. If I wanted that to happen whilst he was watching HD videos, I would pay for a bigger pipe. So I'm paying for it.
Yeah, but your assumption there, Jesse, is that ISPs don't suffer from contention at all, and they can provide all their subscribers with the advertised service all of the time, any of the time. And that simply isn't the case. I mean, since the days of dial-up, you used to have a rack of modems where if every subscriber attempted to connect at the same time, it would just fail because there simply weren't enough modems to connect them. And it's the same with ISPs today. They have a fixed width of pipe at their end, and because people aren't using it continuously, they can actually get enough subscribers through at the advertised levels most of the time. But if people start downloading huge amounts of torrent ISOs, for instance, or watching loads of Netflix, that sucks that away. Now, I guess you could argue that's the ISP's problem, and they really ought to upgrade their infrastructure to support the services to everybody they're advertising. But it costs an absolute fortune. It's just not the way the telecommunications industry works.
Sorry, the way the telecommunications industry works is not to upgrade their infrastructure because it costs a lot of money. But, it costs me, 20 quid a month or whatever. It costs every single person who is listening to this probably 20 quid a month. There are millions of people, everyone in the UK and probably the US and places that are listening to this are connected to the internet. And they must be getting shed tons of money. Can it really be that big an infrastructure upgrade?
Well, what I think Paddy's saying is that it's not a case of just upgrading it, because you just do that forever, wouldn't you? You can't expect to have enough bandwidth for everyone to be maxing it out all the time, because that just doesn't make business sense, because people aren't maxing it out all the time. And you would definitely have to charge people a lot more in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, this is why people have leased lines if they are really concerned about their throughput and guaranteed quality of service.
Well, I suppose let's look over at South Korea, and they have everyone and every apartment has multiple gigabit download. Don't get me wrong, it's a smaller geographical area to be dealing with, so they can put in more fiber and things, and they are not resting on legacy hardware like a lot of Europe and America is. But they are looking towards delivering content, delivering all their TV over the internet. And if we're talking about HD or even 4K, you can't even start considering that until you've got vast amounts of bandwidth. And I wonder if potentially, the West, or what we consider Europe, America sort of thing, maybe will be left behind by other countries who are upgrading and moving over to a fully internet-delivered information and content and things like this, and will be sort of laughed at as we're not upgrading. And maybe that requires the government to step in and bang some fibre in the ground. But I still don't see how you can have one ISP saying, well, if you want faster Netflix, you have to pay for this. Whereas you might end up with another ISP saying, if you want faster Sky, you have to pay for us. And then before you know it, you're in a position where you have to pick your ISP based on what they're giving you, at a rate that you want to consume. And then you don't have a neutral field for everyone to play in. It should just be, we are the ISPs and we deliver everything equally. If you've got one ISP that preferred Netflix, you're skewing the whole argument, and it all just gets it starts to get very, very odd in that ISP level, and you no longer have competition between them. And then when you don't have competition, you have real problems when it comes to driving down prices and things. Now, I'm sure there's a number of American listeners who are rolling their eyes because I've looked up some numbers, and something like 95% of Americans only have 2 ISPs to choose from, which is ridiculous, and that is a problem they have on their end. Whereas over in this country, I can think of, don't get me wrong, I'm in central London, so it's quite easy for me, but I've maybe half a dozen or so to choose from. But if they're not all equal, it makes it really difficult to then, do you know what I mean? Like, it makes it really difficult to choose one, and you have to look at what are they fast laning, what are they preferring, as opposed to what is this other one preferring.
But if they were all equal, how would you make a choice anyway? What's the competition there? If everyone is offering the same service, with the only differentiator presumably being price, everyone will go out of business apart from the cheapest person.
Well, there are things outside of price that you can get. For example, if you're a Sky TV subscriber, you can get discount on your broadband, or you can get your phone and broadband together, or there's one that you can have by the month, and therefore you might be renting and it works out better for you that way. You might be supporting smaller local businesses or what have you. I'm with EE, and it just so happens, as you say, they were cheaper than Sky, so I switched. And by happy coincidence, the router they sent me has AC wireless in it as well, so I stepped up to AC. So there are benefits that you can get, maybe hardware-wise, or by putting more into the package outside of money alone. And clearly it can't be money alone, or there wouldn't be all of these different ISPs that we can choose from.
Okay, so I started this discussion with the intention of coming to a conclusion here. And before we actually spoke about this, Paddy, you said that it would be a fairly short discussion. And I can see why you thought that, because the whole premise of this is a fallacy, because we've never had net neutrality. And I don't know if you're better at debating than Jesse, but I think that I'm falling down on your side, Paddy, that not so much that I'm against the idea of it. I think that I am broadly for the idea, but it's one of those ideas that's nice in theory and just doesn't work out in practice, because we simply don't have net neutrality. We don't have anything to defend, and to try and, as I asked the question, to try and implement it is impossible.
I know you're trying to get to the end of this, Joe, but let's say all the ISPs had real trouble delivering the amount of Netflix data that all the Netflix customers wanted to watch, and they all reduced it to the point where you couldn't get HD Netflix at a comfortable streaming rate, and so everyone stopped using Netflix. Is that fair?
No.
Well, there we go.
It depends on your terms of service with the ISP, surely. No, it does. I mean, you're buying a service from them, and unless it explicitly states you will get Netflix in HD quality anytime you want, no matter how many other people are also doing that, then you have no right to it. And I use the word right in a correct sense, even though it's in air quotes, because you're just making an assumption that you should have the right to get anything you want anytime at the best possible quality. And unless that's in a contract that you have with your ISP, it simply isn't true.
You must have seen the Comcast Netflix graph of the speed of Netflix and the point at which Netflix signed a deal with Comcast, and their bandwidth just shot up. The rate of delivery of Netflix, tripled overnight, because they they throttled them, and they used it as a way of forcing them to pay the money, to say, okay, we will pay you to be, to basically squeeze money out of Netflix. And it's that level of not control, but that level of gripping gripping a company around the neck and saying, you are going to pay us, and if you don't, we'll just make it to the point where your customers can't watch your programs or whatever whatever it may well be. And it's that level of control which is the worrying thought of not having a neutral net.
Yeah, in recent couple of weeks, we've also seen Netflix throttling themselves on AT&T and Verizon. So it's not the evil ISPs in this case; it's evil Netflix trying to make the networks look bad.
All right, well, it seems like quite a big discussion.
It's funny. I was kind of coming to a conclusion, but I don't know. Again, I haven't fully formed my opinion on this yet, but I think I'm definitely leaning towards Paddy's, and I'm going to have to do a bit more reading about this. I think yet more reading and thought.
I think one of the big problems here is definition. I mean, I suspect in my head, my idea of net neutrality, which is purely to do with traffic shaping, is somewhat different from Jesse's, and that'll be different from an awful lot of the other listeners. I mean, for most of the American public, at least, what they know about net neutrality will have been put into their brains from watching a John Oliver video, which is quite famous, and included that chart you were talking about with Comcast and Netflix a minute ago, Jesse. And Oliver does exactly what I'm worried about in this debate within that video, and he's conflating several different things. There's the pure net neutrality aspect that I have in my head with things like lack of competition within the ISP, the last mile market, if you like, in the States. And they're two totally different things. I mean, monopoly practices in the States should be dealt with by monopoly laws. It's nothing to do with actual traffic shaping, if you like. But a public out there have got a view of this where you've got a whole bunch of things intertwined, and therefore it's no wonder that we've all got different opinions on it, because we're all actually thinking about slightly different things and talking past each other.
Well, I'm sure that we're going to return to this at some point, so it'd be good to hear what the listeners have to say about this. I'm sure there's some very, very strong opinions out there. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, all.
See you later.